So good evening, everyone. As Emma said, I'm a practitioner psychologist. I'm currently based in Nottingham. Part of my role is teaching at the university here in Nottingham, and I do a lot of work within the criminal justice system. And alongside that, I do work with charities as a safeguarding lead. So I've now been with Untangle for about 2 years now, and as part of that role, I've been kind of working with them about kind of informing people about grief and loss. So it felt kind of right this evening to meet to talk about the impact of loss and what that can be like to each of us. So just to start with, we know that grief is a normal and natural reaction to a significant loss, and at Untangle we believe that the goal is not about conquering loss and getting back to normal, but instead growing around your grief. So I'll take you through the impact of loss and the psychology behind our feelings tonight, and with this knowledge we hope that you can allow yourself the time and space to process your loss. The main message to kind of get across this evening is that loss is a highly individual experience and that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. And I'm sure you've all kind of experienced different views around grief and loss, and hopefully we'll be talking about some of that later. So here's a quote that says, "The experience of loss may be universal, but responses to loss are widely variable, and there is no one clearly defined course or process of bereavement or grieving." So whilst we know that loss and death are universal experiences, responses can be unique, individual and personal. As I've said, there's no correct way to grieve. The process of coping with loss is unique to each person, including the circumstances of the loss, whether that's anticipated, expected, or whether it's welcomed, and the meaning attributed to the loss and the resources that are available to the person at the time. So we're going to start by having a look at some of the myths that surround loss and grieving that have permeated through society, which may have led friends, family, and even key professionals to believe them to be true. Unfortunately, these myths affect the expectations and advice which people may have regarding loss and how to cope best with it, and which can cause distress to those that are grieving when we're questioning whether what we're doing is right or wrong. Going through these today will hopefully give you the time and space to reflect on how these myths have affected your grieving process, and hopefully by being aware of these myths as well as some real experience of loss can help us see beyond the stereotypes and the shame that we may have felt about how we should be grieving, and instead focus on what we're truly feeling and what we want to do about that. It's also a great point to also take a moment to kind of understand that it's fundamental that we all also acknowledge anticipatory grief. This refers to the response to an unexpected death, even if it's not thought of when that may happen in the future. Most of us think of grief as something which happens after death, and where in fact it can happen a long time beforehand, where this is often not acknowledged, spoken about, or discussed, or even understood. So it may have been that you feel that you've been grieving for quite a long time prior to the death of the person that you've lost. So just maybe taking some time to acknowledge that. So one of the myths around grief and loss are the stage theories of grief, which seem to be present throughout popular culture. However, evidence has shown that the grieving process is neither a linear nor a fixed progression of stages. The truth is that some people may never experience some of the stages that we see listed as kind of stage theories of grief. As I've said, everyone's grief is unique to them. And most people won't experience kind of some of these stages that are on the screen now. We may have kind of jumped back or forth kind of from some of these stages, where some people may have not experienced any of these at all. While some people and some researchers prefer to often talk about some of the components of grief rather than the stages, because by listing it as stages, it's saying that you should go from one step to another. So for some of these, I'm just going to go through them just briefly now. So you may have experienced shock and numbness. So this may be an immediate reaction of maybe disbelief, detachment from the experience that you've had. You may have experienced yearning and searching. You may have felt that the person is physically still with you. And to some extent, this may be in some ways denying that death. This is most likely to arise in daily habits, such as waking up and expecting the person to be there with you, or messaging someone, or having kind of a daily call with someone. And these mistakes may be confusing or even frightening, but they are completely normal. We know that our daily habits become automatic and ingrained in us, and any change in that is going to take some time to incorporate that into our new routine and habit. We may have experienced disorganisation and despair, so there may be periods of time where you feel isolated, uninterested, or even shut off from the rest of the world. You may have felt that everyone was kind of around you towards kind of the early stages of the loss, and then kind of that dissipates and people aren't around anymore. This may feel overwhelming and never-ending, so that may have been something that you did or you have felt. And then there's reorganisation and recovery. So eventually the pain may ease. You may be able to talk about the person who's passed without feeling the same way that you did at the start, or completely different. This may be accompanied in some ways by renewed strength and passion. You may return to old interests that you had, or you may pursue kind of new interests. And it may feel that sometimes you were disloyal to the person that's passed for moving on. But if you just take the moment to remember that they're always part of who you are, and you can allow yourself that time to enjoy the present while keeping them within our thoughts. And as we'll see on the next couple of slides, there is not a time limit on the grieving process. Grief may continue for a lifetime as we continue to love that person that we've lost. Other kind of components that we may have seen as part of stage theories of loss may have been denial, anger, depression, acceptance. So you may have been kind of familiar to those kind of stages you may have seen. However, evidence has shown that grieving isn't that kind of linear and stage process. And some people may never have experienced sadness, depression, while some may never reach acceptance. And we'll explore that a little bit later. So this is another common belief that distress and depression are inevitable when dealing with loss, and that lack of it means that something's wrong with that person. However, recent studies have shown that between 35 and 50% of people who experience loss will experience low levels of distress, and they will continue to not function as normal after a loss. Where between 10 to 20% of people will experience some distress and not be able to function nonetheless. So just because you may have not felt yourself being severely upset or struggling with kind of the normal function of life, it doesn't mean that you lack empathy or that you didn't care or love that person that you lost. That's a normal experience. I find that some people come to therapy saying people are expecting me to be angry or to be really upset, and I'm not. It's like what is wrong with me? And I think the popular opinion is that we should be feeling a lot of distress around loss, and for some that doesn't happen for a variety of reasons that we've just discussed. But for those that do feel distress, you may have had some physical reactions around that, which may have included nausea, headaches, loss of appetite, insomnia, shortness of breath, fatigue, and sensitivity to noise are some of the common physical reactions towards grief and loss. Of the emotional reactions, you may have felt sadness, anger, fear, anxiety, hopelessness, jealousy, been frustrated, felt guilt, loneliness. And then we move on to some of the cognitive reactions, which may have included an inability to concentrate. You may have found it difficult kind of returning to work or being able to function how you did previously. Maybe some obsessive thinking, disorientation and confusion, a sense of the deceased presence in your life still, diminished self-control, emptiness, or maybe kind of replaying the loss and kind of the circumstances around that loss in your mind. Some of the behavioural responses may have included searching behaviours, avoiding or seeking reminders of the deceased, obsessive activity, social withdrawal, increased use of alcohol or other substances. And spiritual responses, this may have involved searching for a meaning in the loss, changing your spiritual or religious beliefs, asking about the meaning or the purpose of life without the deceased, So we can see just how much grief and loss can impact on each individual. And as we've said from the start, grief and loss impacts each of us in such an individual way. But the most important way to keep yourself well whilst grieving is just taking care of yourself and your needs and just being aware of exactly how you're feeling. Bereavement is regarded as one of the worst things to happen to a person, and that such grief is inherently seen as a negative experience. So please kind of acknowledge that it is okay to sometimes feel these responses, and that is entirely normal. However, research has also shown that at times it can serve as a catalyst for some positive changes, and for some of you that may have also been the case. Another myth around grief and loss is that it just takes time. Similarly to the stages of grief, there isn't a specific time frame. Grief isn't something that we get through or that we get over. It's unfortunately not something that we conquer grief or that we get back to normal. It's about living to learn with this new life and this new reality. We may feel conscious or under pressure from others of whether we're taking too little or too much time. However, this is different for each person and affected by so many different factors. 10 to 25% of people who experience loss report long-term distress and difficulty functioning. This shows that recovery is different for each individual. Losing someone may be something that we carry with us for the rest of their lives, and we can build skills and get support to help with this process. So we're next going to have a look at some of the unhelpful and helpful strategies that you may have experienced whilst going through grief and loss. And it's important to acknowledge that these behaviours and thoughts and emotions are just what we do on an individual basis to adjust to the changes that occur in our lives. Some strategies that you may have done, that you may think of, are more helpful than others, and they vary for each individual. As we've said, there's no right way or wrong way to grieve, and for each person, they may find support and comfort in their own unique strategies. So we may engage in what we may call unhelpful strategies. These may be encouraged by the prevalence of the myths around grief that we've just discussed, or a perceived lack of alternative strategies that we feel that we have at that time. It's worth remembering that these strategies, like all coping strategies, do have a function, and that's why we engage in them, even if they're not helpful in the long term. So it's been able to acknowledge kind of in the short term that we do find a function for them, and that's why we call them coping strategies for that time. So here's a slide that's looking at some of the unhelpful and helpful strategies that I've seen in some of the therapy work that I've done for a number of years with people that are grieving. So I'll just take a moment for you to have a quick read through that, and I'll talk you through each of those. So as we've said, the unhelpful strategies may be helpful in the short term, and it's then worth considering kind of how these then move forward and have some long-term negative or positive impact on your life. So to start with, we've got distraction here. So keeping yourself busy, to not think or feel anything unpleasant, whether that be alcohol, drugs, work, sleep, or being on social media. Distraction can be useful, but only when you acknowledge the underlying problem and kind of the reason for that. But as we've said, it's got the function in the short term. Sinking into the sadness, so whether that be overthinking or not allowing yourself to engage in the things that have made you happy, or even feeling guilty when you have that happy moment and thinking, should I be feeling this way? That loved person is no longer with us. Denial, so we may feel that we want to refuse to accept the loss. So we want to kind of live in a bubble of denial and not want to speak to anyone around us because we don't want to be reminded of what's happened. This in the long term may only reinforce the problem and allow it to snowball over time. Judging others is another one that comes up quite often, where people find that they're more focused on people around them and thinking, are they managing their loss and grief in the right way? And as we've just said, people manage their emotions in a completely different way and manage grief and loss in entirely different ways. So focusing on other people and being critical on their behaviours may not be beneficial in the long term. Isolation, so avoiding other people, rejecting help, saying that everything's okay when maybe it isn't. And often the thoughts we have in our minds are far worse than what would happen if we approached the person or the situation. And instead, we give in to the fearful thinking, and this doesn't allow us the opportunity to test what we're thinking. So are we thinking, okay, it's not going to be helpful if I go and kind of be around the friends that know that person, or be around family that know that person, but unless we put ourselves in a situation to test that and say, okay, actually, is it okay? Am I actually getting some kind of short-term rewards from being around others that can share their memories and share kind of what's happened with me? Is that better for me at this time? Some of the helpful strategies that are discussed often are acceptance, so being able to recognise your experience and emotions without judgment and saying, okay, it's okay that I'm feeling this way. As we've seen, there's a lot of myths that are so common in society around grief and loss, and it's saying, okay, I'm actually doing okay with how I'm feeling, and this is acceptable, that I'm feeling this way. I've lost someone so important in my life. Accepting that life is full of challenges and that injustice does happen can often help us find more effective strategies to manage. Expression, so sharing your experience in some form, whether that be in writing, art, pictures, writing blogs, having conversations with others, coming to group chats like this and kind of being involved with other people that know how it feels at this time and you can express that in some form. Self-compassion is another one, so being kind to yourselves and your emotions, so allowing yourself to experience some of the positives and not forcing yourself to take on more than you can handle. We know how busy things can be after the loss of a loved one, and it's stepping back and thinking, okay, what do I need to do in this moment? What exactly do I have the space for? And allowing yourself not to take on more than you need to in that moment. Mindfulness. So for some people this means entirely different things, and for some it is just taking a moment to be in the moment. So for example, just taking a minute of breathing, whether that's meditating or focusing just on the task in hand, whether that's reading or just doing the dishes. Just allowing yourself to be present in the moment without kind of overthinking everything and thinking, okay, what else have I got to do, or kind of what else is kind of going on? How is someone else feeling? It's okay. In this moment, this is what I'm doing and this is how I feel. So it might be kind of helpful after today to kind of reflect on maybe one helpful or one unhelpful strategy that resonates with you in your experience of grief and loss, and think about how it affected your thoughts, feelings and behaviours. What were the short-term rewards, and what could be some of the long-term negative and positive impacts of these. And then hopefully this can kind of help build your goals and identify exactly what's helped, so that if kind of you're feeling a certain way again, then you know, okay, this is what worked for me, and kind of redo that helpful strategy. It's worth remembering that these strategies, like all coping strategies, do have a function. That's why we engage in them, even if they're not helpful in the long term. So please do not kind of feel critical towards yourself if you have engaged in any of those unhelpful strategies. That's why the un is in parentheses. So as we said, emotions can be complex, but they're essential to the way that we perceive and experience and process our lives, and they've got a strong impact on what we do, and they can feel all-consuming. But believing myths and expecting ourselves to fit into them can make us feel worse when we don't act the way that we should, believe that we should. The way that we talk to ourselves, for example, when we feel like we've done something wrong, can have such a strong impact on how we feel about ourselves and others. So there's good examples of how positive thoughts can work and how beliefs and actions can affect how we feel. I just wanted to kind of share, because I know some people may be thinking, okay, looking at kind of some of the strategies, is it beneficial for me to receive kind of bereavement support? And I know that for some of you, you have kind of engaged in some of the support groups through Untangle, and that's kind of how you found out about today. So for anyone kind of wondering, okay, what is a psychologist, what's a therapist, what's a counsellor, because I know that's a question that frequently comes out of these sessions, that a bereavement counsellor explores kind of your bereavement and how it's affected you specifically, and they'll kind of look at kind of building a space for you to explore your grief safely and supported and without any judgment. Whereas for some people, kind of one-to-one therapy works. For some people, group therapy works really well by being kind of around others to share that experience and share kind of how you're feeling, and to be able to have those reflections and those realizations that, okay, these are the myths, but have anyone actually felt they've worked through any of those myths themselves? So yeah, there's plenty of ways that people find kind of relevant support if that's what they're wanting to do outside of kind of their friends and family, if that's what works better for you. But emotional support is likely to consist of opportunities to discuss the loss, its consequences, and thus encouraging kind of the thought process around it rather than the distraction techniques that we've just looked at on the helpful strategies. So I've already kind of briefly mentioned this, but as Emma spoke about it at the start, through Untangle we also offer group therapy sessions, which is based upon cognitive behavioural therapies. So it looks at how your thoughts influence your feelings and then your behaviours. And within kind of the group setting, you look at things that you're managing well, things that you're struggling with, and connect with others that understand. So as we've said, we know that loss is a highly individual experience. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. And through kind of being with others in this setting and kind of through the services that are available at Untangle and other organisations, it's just a great opportunity to have a think and talk and share those experiences with people that understand. My email is on this last slide, so if anyone's got any questions following the session tonight, then please do not hesitate to get in contact. It's always great to hear from people if they've got any questions around kind of the content that we've discussed, or whether you've got any questions about kind of other support that is available to you. Yeah, it's just so important to know that you're not alone in that. So there's my email address if anyone's got any questions.